My name is Rick Gerard, and I'm going to present to you a little motion tracking workflow I like to call the stabilized power pin. It's a very efficient way of stabilizing a surface so you can add basically anything to it. Artwork, 3D model, doesn't matter. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is import the footage. We've got a shot here. It's already been trimmed from the client, and we've got a graphic that they've supplied, sample graphic. So drag those into After Effects and we'll get started. The first thing I want to do is open the footage in the footage panel and figure out exactly what you want to do with the shot. It's already been trimmed by the client. Had it not been trimmed, you could set in and out points here to trim the shot before you create a composition from the footage. Let's talk about the design here. We need to add some graffiti to the back of this bench. We've got a actor sitting on the bench that we need to create a mask for, and we have a foreground actor that moves in front of the bench. Let's just watch the shot here. It's pretty stable, a little camera movement, so we should be able to track that. And so let's get started. First thing we want to do is save the project, give it a good name, and then we're going to just drag the footage into the timeline to create a new composition. Everything is going to match: the frame rates, the frame size, and the duration. Let's start organizing our composition. First order of business is to rename the footage layer original footage. And then I'm going to move down the timeline to find the very first frame that we need to start tracking the bench. The first frame the bench comes into view, and that would be this one. And then we'll split the layer using the keyboard shortcut and duplicate the layer one more time as a reference for the artwork. We'll rename it artwork. And then we're going to need another copy of this layer for the track mat for the foreground actor, so we'll duplicate it one more time. And we'll rename that track mat. We don't need to see the layer right now, so we turn it off, and let's move down to layer number 3. Rename this original footage tracking. The next step is to apply Mocha AE to this tracking layer. And I have a plug-in from Video Copilot called FX Console. It helps me find things very quickly. I'd highly recommend it, and I'll post a link. So I'm just going to use FX Console to search for Mocha and click, or you can use the Effects and Presets panel to search for Mocha and apply it to the layer with a double click. You click on the Mocha icon to open Mocha. It opens in the Essentials workspace, but I much prefer the Classic workspace. Gives you a lot more options, things to work with, especially if you need to adjust the track. So let's start analyzing our clip. Let's move down the timeline here and kind of analyze the scene. We're going to need to do a corner pin track on the back of the bench here, and we're going to need to create a holdout mat or mask for the foreground actor so that it doesn't interfere with our corner pin tracking. So let's do that first by creating a simple spline, an X spline around the actor. It doesn't have to be too terribly accurate. That should do it, and then we'll just set a couple of keyframes by adjusting some points to make sure that this mask stays pretty tight to the foreground actor. Okay, that should do that. So we've renamed this holdout, and we're going to turn off the tracking cog or gear and lock the layer. So let's start the corner pin spline. Again, using the X spline tool, we'll just grab the 4 corners of the bench. I'm going to speed this process up, and once we get the spline adjusted the way we want it, we are going to run a tracker in reverse and see how things work. For tracking options, we're going to make sure we have perspective checked and increase the minimum number of pixels to about 30%. Then we'll run the tracker in reverse and see what happens. Well, it looks like it failed, so let's undo the track, make some adjustments to the spline. I'm going to make it actually a little smaller. In this case, smaller is probably going to be better. And we'll run the tracker again. Before we track again, I'm going to reduce the minimum number of pixels to about 25 and then go ahead and run the tracker again. And it looks pretty good. It goes a little wonky at the last frame, but we can fix that with the adjust track tools in just a few moments. Okay, let's use the keyframe navigator to jump to the starting point, and we're going to track forwards. But I want to talk a little bit about what a surface is. We click on the surface tool here. We get this little blue rectangle, and I can adjust the corners of the rectangle to match the back of the bench. Okay. Now this is the surface that we are defining, not the surface we are tracking, and this does not animate. When you track, it just follows the pixels that the spline is looking at. Okay, so we're going to get it all set up. It's pretty easy to see, but it's easier to see if we go through and add a grid. I'll add this one here, the 16 by 16, and that will help us visualize whether or not the track is perfect. And as it tracks along here, you see that the track works pretty darn well. We can also see that the holdout is doing a good job. And let's fast forward to the end and drag the left edge of the surface all the way to fill the whole bench. And now let's preview our track. Okay, it's running just fine. Everything looks good, except right back at the end, and we're going to fix that now using the adjust track options. Okay, so let's move to the last good frame, and we'll go down and select adjust track, set a master for all, and that's going to be our starting point for these little red squares that indicate the very corners of our surface. It's kind of hard to keep from grabbing the wrong point, so we're going to grab the edge of the surface, get the double-ended arrow, and just drag it to the left to get it away from our corner points that we're going to be adjusting. So let's take a look again at the UI here. We're going to press the X key and slide over so we can see everything. And again, this is the master. These little icons tell us which corner we're grabbing and give us a preview. There's no preview over here because they're in the black, but let's start with the bottom left corner. And then we'll move forward a frame, and let's move that bottom left corner icon right to the corner of the frame here, and then go up to the top, get that adjusted, and that looks pretty good. Now these were down over here someplace, not exactly sure where they are, but they were kind of down that way. And we'll just double check the animation back and forth. Okay. The left points need adjusting a little bit, so we'll just monkey around with this for a minute until we get it to where it's pretty usable. Okay, I'm going to speed up this process here, and you can see I'm just checking back and forth between these two keyframes, getting it to where I think it's good enough. Then we're going to switch to the back to the track mode, and we're going to adjust the surface by grabbing the edges and then fine-tuning the corners until we get the back of the bench perfectly aligned. And we'll run one more preview. Shift +8 will center up the view, and let's just double check one last time. Okay. Everything looks just fine. Yep, I call that good enough. What we're going to want to do is expand the surface so we have a little more to work with in our corner pin comp. So I'm going to make it a little taller and a little wider and fine-tune everything so that we've got plenty to work with because this surface is going to end up being the full frame of our composition. Now the last step is to just save our work. It would have been a good idea to lock that layer and then return to After Effects. So back in Mocha, we are going to spin down the tracking data. We're going to create the tracking data by selecting our corner pin track. And these values have all changed. We'll press the U key once to reveal the keyframes, and they all look good. So let's apply now this corner pin data directly to the artwork layer. Okay, we end up with this kind of odd looking layer here. I've got it soloed. And what we're going to do now is turn off corner pin, and we're going to make some magic happen. I have an animation preset. Search for it here. It is called Stabilized Power Pin. Here it is right there. And going to apply this, and what's going to happen is going to fill the composition with the surface that we created in Mocha. And let me show you how that works here. Let's just expand the timeline here. Press the E key to reveal the effects, and take a look. We've got the four corners of power pin tied to the same four corners of corner pin, and unstretched turned on. You can make your own just by grabbing the pick whip and tie each of the corners together. And what we end up with is this nice, completely stabilized seat back that gives us an easy palette to work on to create our graffiti. Okay, so the next step is to pre-compose. We're going to move all attributes and adjust the duration to the length of the layers and open up the composition. Inside this comp, we are going to create a reference frame using, let's just use the pen tool and create a simple rectangle that just outlines, it just has a stroke, and it just outlines the back of the seat. When that's all done, we return to the main composition and check to make sure that our track is accurate and the corner pin is all working. So back in the main comp, we still have a problem, but we can fix that by returning to Mocha and applying the export once again to the artwork layer. Okay, there we go. The frame is perfectly attached to the bench. So we jump back to the artwork comp, and we're going to add an empty shape layer as a placeholder, and let's rename these layers. And then we want to move to the very last frame, and we're going to go to the composition menu and save this frame as a Photoshop layered file. Okay, as soon as we have the file saved, we want to import the layer as footage. And in the footage options, we want to choose the graffiti layer, that's the empty shape layer we just created, as the source. Then we'll drag it right into our timeline and press Command or Control plus E to edit the original, and that will open Photoshop. I'm going to very quickly go over the workflow in Photoshop. First thing we want to do is lock the bottom two layers so they don't move. And then we're going to open the client-supplied graphic file, and we will grab that file with the selection tool and drag it over into our saved Photoshop file. Now we're going to drag this layer 1 below the graphic layer and then merge them using the shortcut keys. And then we're going to use the transform tools to fit the graphic right to the reference frame. Then we will return to After Effects. Every time you save the Photoshop file, it will automatically update in After Effects. So here we are with our new replacement graphic as layer 1. Now we need to create a track mat. The easiest way to get started doing that would be to turn off layer 1, and then we're going to add a new solid I like to pick a good complementary color so I can see through it. Then set the blend mode to overlay, and then just use the pen tool. I prefer Rotobriush splines. So we'll select that, use the pen tool, and just create a quick mask right around our actor, and the mask only needs to extend past the reference frame. Okay? Don't need to do a lot of roto here, and he doesn't move much. So we will press Control or Command plus M to set the mask keyframe. Then we'll move down to the start of the timeline and set a couple of the keyframes, fine-tune this, and with just 3 or 4 keyframes we should be able to get a very good track matte. When the mask looks pretty good, let's turn back on our Photoshop layer and set the track matte as an inverted alpha track matte and check our work. We're going to need a little feathering on the mask and maybe a little adjustment here and there. But that looks pretty good, so let's go to the main comp and see how it looks. Well, that looks pretty good, but we've got a problem. Our foreground actor is being hidden. So we're going to use our track matte layer. Probably the easiest tool to use is Rotobrush. So let's move to the first frame where our actor just comes into frame, and then we'll set the endpoint of this track matte layer right there, and we'll apply Rotobrush. Rotobrush is a paint effect, and so the paint workspace is going to be the most efficient. Let's open that up, and let's select our tool, size up the brush properly, and just trace along the edge of the window frame here and down across our actor until we get to his chin. And then we'll apply the Refine Edge tool. This selection looks pretty darn good. So we're just going to apply Refine Edge, trace right along the same area, and then we'll see if it'll propagate properly. It should. This is a perfect. This shot is a perfect candidate for that. So we'll just press the space bar and let it propagate. And that's looking pretty good. In fact, I like it. It should be just fine. And so we're going to freeze and then return to the default workspace. Yeah, and that looks pretty darn good. It's probably going to be better if we use this as an inverted alpha track matte. And, you know, it would be a lot better if this graffiti was transparent. So let's return to the artwork comp and see what we can do about making that graffiti layer transparent. The background colors are pretty uniform, so I'm going to apply Key Light and sample the kind of an average background color here. Then I'm going to go to the Combine Matte and make a couple of small adjustments. And that is probably good enough. And then we return to final output, and let's return to the main comp and see how things look. We are pretty darn close. The only thing that's wrong is it's a little too sharp and it doesn't match the motion blur. So let's solve that by adding a couple of filters. I'm going to pre-compose this artwork layer, layer number 2, one more time, so that I can add pixel motion blur and Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur will work with the corner pin applied, but pixel motion blur will not, so we have to pre-compose. I'm going to add these two effects, make a couple of adjustments, and fine-tune this so that it looks like it's part of the bench. There you go. The shot looks pretty good. We've successfully stabilized a surface and removed all the motion by using Mocha AE and CC Power Pen. We've added graphics. We have then put the motion back in the shot, again with Mocha AE and this time corner pin. And we've done a little color correction using pixel motion blur and Gaussian blur to match the original footage. So that wraps up the stabilized power pen workflow. I hope you enjoyed it and that it serves you well. This is Rick Gerard saying please subscribe, like my videos, and look for more After Effects tutorials in the near future. Have a great day.